lost private. We're in Normandy.
Welcome, everyone, to the We're Not Lost Private podcast. This is episode 29. I'm your host, Joe Muccia, and I am fairly excited about my next guest. Charles Herrick has been someone who's been on my radar as far back as 2015 when I first spotted his research on the nearby cafe there. It's they have a photographic section where you can kind of, I don't know, dissect. How would you say it, Chuck? Would they, you could kind of dissect and look at photographs with a much more discerning eye to pick out details and kind of flesh them out, get the story behind the photograph. Does that sound about right?
Absolutely. I'm the only non-photographer on that website. I'm just there for the military context kind of stuff. You've got some, Alan Coleman, who runs that. He was the first picture editor for New York Times, picture critic, pardon me. J. Ross Bauman, who's also on the project. He won a Pulitzer Prize when he was 23. In fact, I think he competed against himself. He had two other stories that were up for the Pulitzer Prize, and he was the photo editor for Washington Times. And then you can't really encapsulate the broad scope of accomplishments of those two guys in a couple minutes like this. And then we had two other photographers who came in with some great details on the technical end of things. So yeah, so they were involved in the photo arts, photojournalism end of things, and then do a real great job analyzing.
Yep. And what we're talking about is Chuck's book, Back into Focus, looking at the myths of the real story of Robert Capa, his D-Day actions on D-Day, and his photographs. To get a little housekeeping out of the way, we are on Patreon. You can find us at patreon.com/We're Not Lost Private Podcast. You can find us on YouTube, Apple Music, Amazon, Spotify, and a whole host of other podcatchers out there. If you feel strongly about the podcast and you want to help us keep going, you can join as a paid subscriber at Patreon. You get all kinds of benefits from that, including background material, photographs, etc., research items that don't normally appear out on the web. And I'll also have the links where you can purchase Chuck's book if you're looking to get it. I highly recommend it. As we exchanged emails prior to the show in the weeks running up, I mentioned to Chuck, it's a very good read. It's very dense in a good way. When you're looking at myths like this, you have to do your homework and you have to present your case with facts. And he's done a brilliant job in that. But if you're ready, I can bring up your slides and we can start rolling along if you like.
Well, let me first make a pitch for your channel. I really enjoyed your videos. I really enjoyed the title of them. We're Not Lost Private. I recall making that comment once or twice in my career. Yeah, I'd encourage anybody to dive in and subscribe to your channel and the widest dissemination possible.
Thanks, I appreciate it. I'll get your slides up and then we can get this kicked off. For those of you who are just listening along, we'll try and be as descriptive as possible. So just bear along with us as we do this. And we're off and running. All right. Like I said before, I just wanted to get a little background. How'd you get so interested in Capa and his photographs to the point where you felt strongly enough to write a book where you kind of deep dive all of the aspects of it?
Well, it wasn't a conscious decision. I mean, I remember early on taking a look at the photograph. I'm going to take a look at it here in a minute, called "The Falling Soldier" or "Death of a Loyalist Militiaman," and saying that just doesn't look right. This looks staged. And that always been in the back of my mind. And every time I saw something from Capa, I'd take a look at it and always had something in the back of my mind that said, these just don't look right. And then I stumbled on Alan Coleman's project, the Alternate History Project, where he and Ross had started examining this. And I contacted him on a peripheral military matter and just kind of got eased in over the next 10 years of examining one aspect of it or not. And suddenly I look back and I've got tons of pages of research and information, and figured it was time to put it together and put it on out there.
Natural progression. I mean, and like you lay out, you will lay out as we go along. I, like many others, is, to me, when you at first blush, the photographs, especially the D-Day photographs, they're striking in their um, in that what they may represent. But I think as you'll go along, you'll show what they don't represent is almost as interesting as what they do, or what they don't show is as interesting as what they do. Um, but well, if you want, we can talk about Kappa quite a little bit here, and then I'll bring up those photographs, the falling man photograph, and we can get going.
Yeah, just a little bit on Robert Capa for those who don't know him. He's a famous war photographer, combat photographer. Um, but he wasn't an American. He was born in Hungary, born to a lower middle class family that owned a dress shop. Um, as he tells the story, he got in trouble with the law because of his socialist connections and was jailed and was told that he had to leave the country. They'd release him from jail, but he had to leave the country. And whether that's true or not, we don't know. They certainly allowed him to stay and finish out his year in high school, graduated. And then his parents sent him off to Berlin. He spent about 2 years there. But after about a year, his parents' business basically collapsed, and they couldn't afford to support him anymore. And that kind of started the hungry years for him, when he was kind of flirting with the photography business, but was absolutely poor broke. And about that time, Hitler became chancellor. And as a Jew, Robert Capa decided that Andre Friedman at the time, decided that he couldn't stay in Berlin anymore. And he finally ended up in Paris. And it was still hunger times there. France was in depression too, and he was a foreigner. And as a foreigner trying to get work in somebody else's country during the depression, that's always hard. And he led a tough, hungry life at that point. And he unfortunately got some habits of theft and deceit and whatnot to survive, which are understandable, but may have carried on through his professional career. But while in Paris, he began to start getting more and more shots, more business, got more into the photographic field. He was never very good in the dark room, but his pictures became more salable, I guess you'd say. At one point, he was sent up to photograph Trotsky in a speech up in Copenhagen. And this is kind of I only bring this up to kind of show how Capa tended to exaggerate everything. He had tickets. His newspaper sent him up there with tickets for the speech. But the way Capa then spun the story afterwards was, well, they didn't want photographers in there. Trotsky loved photographers. I mean, there's plenty of photos of him for that tour. But so Capa told the story that he had to sneak in by going in, hiding with a group of laborers and blah, 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 blah. And none of that was actually true, but that's how he tended to wrap every little anecdote in some pretty outrageous kinds of details. And so you never were quite sure where the truth kind of ended and the fabrication began.
Yeah, I think as our viewers and listeners, when they get their hands on your book, they're gonna you establish fairly early on that Capa runs fast and loose with the truth in almost every major item in his life or incident in his life. He runs kind of fast and loose, and I feel comfortable in saying that because again, he methodically went through each piece of the major portions of his life, especially all the D-Day items, and really lay out the disparity between his accounts in his own biography, his own autobiography, and then the biographies that follow from Whalen, how fast and loose he does play with it. But one thing I wanted to backtrack on a little bit is he had no formal training in photography, did he?
No, he kind of learned he didn't go to college, but didn't study it in any formal school. He picked it up basically being mentored by various folks. And none of them really said that he was a very good technical photographer, but the consensus was he tended to capture the right moment.
I was going to say his composition seems better than his technical skill at times.
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair to say. Yeah.
So he's in Paris. He goes up. He drafts a story up about the Trotsky piece, but he ends up where he becomes more well known, well regarded when the Spanish Civil War kicks off.
Yeah, while he's in Paris, he met a gal named Gerda Taro. At least that was her nom de guerre. And she and he kind of got into a little bit more level of deception. They were trying to sell their photos. She was very good with the various newspaper editors and getting them to buy photos because she was pretty and she thought that she'd take care of that or take advantage of that. And it generally worked out well. And they invented this persona of a guy named Robert Capa, who was a mysterious American famous photographer. And so Andre went around taking the photos. Gerda would then go to the editors and say, hey, look what this guy named Capa just did. And ended up selling the photos for 3 or more times more than what they would have been if it was just Andre. And so they created this kind of false image. And after a while, Robert Capa became Andre Freeman. And from there on out, he was known as Robert Capa. And the two of them were then sent down to the Spanish Civil War to cover the Loyalist side, which was the revolutionary socialist side of the war. And both of them had been very, very deeply involved in socialist movement, very far left. Capa always swore he was never actually a communist, but he was always in those circles. So he went down there to cover the Loyalist side. And in that process, the very first time out, actually, I think he was only 23 at the time. He takes a famous picture. You can go to that next picture, next slide, if you will, please.
Okay.
And this picture is known, I think the official title of it is The Death of a Loyalist Militiaman. And it's commonly known as the Falling Soldier. And supposedly Capa took this during the Battle of Cerro Mirano in the Cordoba front. And this is the picture as it appeared in the Life magazine or Time magazine in the summer of 37. The picture is actually taken in the fall of 36. And as it's framed and shown and with the caption there, it's just like it looks. The poor guy was killed in the middle of an action. The problem is, now if you go to the next slide, it was actually printed originally with this photo aligned with it or attached to it. And this was done in View magazine in the September, I think, 23rd issue. And it shows a second guy in the exact same position. I mean, even Richard Whalen was the authorized biographer for Capa's story. So he was a curator of the Capa files and very much into this. And even he had to admit times that they were kind of BS or fabricated things. And even Whalen had to admit that, yes, you can even tell there's the same stalks of grass where the two guys are standing. The clouds haven't moved. So the exposure is the same. The shadow's the same. These guys were obviously staged photos. And
yeah, I mean, it begs the question is that, they're obviously in the same spot. Where'd the other guy go if he got killed?
Exactly right. If you go down to one more slide there, this shows how they were actually published in View, the French magazine, in 1936. So people over in France, if they were reading View, they could see this and they could kind of like make their own judgment about, well, okay, do we have some just eye candy for the article, or is this actually a guy getting killed?
Yeah.
But in the US, they only published the one photo, and everybody ended up believing that that was a real moment. Well, it turns out, of course, that there's quite a number of other photos taken during the same time. And it shows the same group of guys. There are probably about 15 of them. These are just two of them. And they're alternately charging across a field, charging at the camera, leaping over entrenchments, lined up, kneeling in the skirmish line, firing. So he'd run into this group of guys, and they were just staging photos.
But,
so then,
especially worldwide, outside of France and the distribution of the French periodical that came out with it, outside of there where they had the both photos, everywhere else is only seeing the singular photo. So his star is on the rise at that point.
that's right. Yeah. Well, once this starts getting out, then you start getting all the excuses for it. He says, okay, even Richard Wayland said, okay, they may have been staged, but it shows the essential truth of war and all sorts of things. It's powerful, and it speaks truth, even though it's not accurate.
Fabricated.
Yeah. They've never actually said fabricated, but you're absolutely right. There's just a lot of excuses for, yes, we were taken in. It's a powerful looking image, and we don't really want to say that it's meaningless because it's faked. And then you had another group that said, oh, well, this was taken on the front lines. And yes, the guys were goofing around and Cap was taking pictures of them. But really the second guy, top one in that photo there, the second guy was actually shot by the other forces, the rebellious forces, across the valley in the middle of all this joking around. So that's actually really a legitimate shot of a guy getting killed. Well, you've got no way of knowing it.
The second picture.
Pardon me?
The second picture?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that kind of stayed in the kind of quasi-debunked status for a while. But in 2007, a professor, Jose Manuel Susperregui, from Spain, he set out to identify exactly where the location of this photo was. And if you pull up the next map, next chart. Yeah, he did a very excellent job of geolocation. And he found that it was actually, pictures actually taken down in Espejo. And you see that at the bottom of the screen there.
Mm-hmm.
And that was fully 30 miles behind where the fighting was taking place at the time, up at Cerro Murano. So that was the total debunking. Okay, there's no chance that these guys were just, posing for the picture, and then the guy was actually killed by an enemy soldier. The enemy soldier, closest one, was 30 miles away. So the whole thing just ended up being completely debunked. And that happened in about 2009, I believe, he published it. And at this point, even the International Center of Photography, which warehouses the Cornell and Robert Capa collection, even they started saying that, yeah, okay, that sounds not only plausible, but probably persuasive. But till today, there's still a wide variety of people who cling to the idea that that photo was actually a legitimate picture of a guy getting shot in combat.
And we'll see that, especially when it comes to the D-Day photos as well. There's a lot of, again, because of the way that they were portrayed, and I know you're going to get into this, and the way that they are published, and the fact that there are no caption notes for a lot of the photos, and there's quite a few of them missing, as we'll talk about. It leads for so many different interpretations of the actuality, that that it makes it it made it very difficult for you, I can tell by your writings and by, the level of detail again that you go through in terms of photo interpretation, looking at landing charts and things of that nature. But it's all part of that. It's just a cascading effect early on where the truth is presented as such, and it takes so much work to debunk it and actually frame it correctly. And I see that it's started at a very early part in his career, and it continued all the way through.
Yeah, most of us will sit there and say that, well, we don't trust the media, or we don't believe what the media says. And generally, that's probably fairly accurate. But there's also a certain other level that we unconsciously do absorb and believe what's presented to us. And if you see a picture with a caption on it, and it's coming from a major periodical, then you tend to think, well, someone's vetted this. This must be true. It must be right. And so you absorb that into your brain without any critical faculty there. You haven't examined it, you just absorb it. And once that's been lodged in your brain for a number of decades even, it's very hard to go back and say, oh, I was wrong. I was taken in on that. And that was kind of the challenge of the book, is that the various layers of the Capa legacy and legend are so thick and interwoven that you just can't say this wasn't true. This wasn't. You have to go into extreme detail about exactly why it isn't.
Yeah, not only that, you can't just look at the photos as in isolation. You have to pull back all the way to and you do this very well in the book, where you start with the embarkation portion of it. Even before that, you go through his roles in the various actions prior to show that leopard doesn't change its spots, in terms of somebody's past performance is a clear indicator of their future performance. And you go through this
even
quite well with him, even after the Spanish Civil War, where it starts and then you see it progress.
thanks. Yeah, even actually before the Spanish Civil War, he'd seen a parachute demonstration, and he really, really, according to Whalen, fell in love with parachuting, the idea, the thrill, the danger, and whatnot. And he wanted to go do a parachute course. And sure enough, his magazine sends him out to do it. And he comes back with a photo story of him doing this parachuting. And even Whalen had to kind of wade in there and say, look, he didn't actually jump. He just took a bunch of photos, rearranged them, and gave him captions so it made it look like he did this parachute jump in outside of Paris. So kind of early on, he got into this mode of creating a story that wasn't quite true, but the pictures tended to make it believable if you put the right narrative around it.
Yeah, we're going to see that through as we go along here.
Yeah, if you don't mind going to the next slide. I referred earlier to the Alternate History Project with Robert Capa on D-Day. Alan Coleman runs the website. J. Ross Bauman, of course, started this off with questions about the issue of the lost film. The missing film refers to the photos that he took on D-Day. He landed and came back with only a small number of films, a small number of negatives. They only had what appeared to be one roll of film, and his first photo was photo number 29. And then he had 10 photos, went up to exposure number 38, pardon me. And so the question always has been, what happened to the 28 roll or 28 films, negatives earlier on that roll? And the excuse that normally became or generally became public later on was that it was ruined in an accident in a drying cabinet where they're drying off the freshly developed negatives. And, a lot of people kind of always looked at that and said, gee, I'd never heard anything like that happening. But it was generally accepted. And most people know nothing about photography. I certainly don't. But Ross Bauman took a look at that and said, this just doesn't make any sense. There were supposedly 4 rolls of film here. How come only one of them had pictures remaining on it? And that started it all off. I got my name there on third. Actually, Rob McElroy got involved in this before I did. He jumped in and he provided some other great insights indicating it was technically impossible to melt the emulsion on the film, which is the excuse. And then Tristan DeCuna came in and he did some excellent experiments with authentic film from that period in drying cabinets, turning the heat up and whatnot. And so the 4 of them did just a fantastic job, completely debunking this idea that most of his film was lost that day due to an intern in the photo lab messing up the film.
Yeah, and I think anybody who's familiar with Capa and the D-Day photographs has probably heard that story, and I think it's so interesting that you have brought in all the folks from different subject matter as the experts to help take a bite out of different parts of this myth to get to the truth of the matter, and it's pretty amazing that, you know, because most folks nowadays, even our high-end photographers out there, mostly work in the digital realm. So working with film itself, a real film, not in the digital medium, is becoming a lost art. So for you to be able to, gather up the expertise of these other folks and help bring the story out, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, Alan did a good job of pulling all these folks together, and my story wouldn't be anything if it weren't for the foundation work that they did in disproving the lab accident, because that's really knocked the supports out of the legend and the lies. Just briefly go to number 7, and then we'll go into the actual pictures. Okay, so the major points of the Capa's D-Day legend is that he volunteered to land with Company E, the 16th Regiment, in the first wave. This is on Omaha Beach, by the way. So that would have put him on the eastern or left side of the assault. And Company E was one of the companies, one of the 4 assault companies that were broken down into 6 30-man landing teams or boat teams. And they were the first infantry ashore. They were going to follow, at least in theory, they were going to follow the DD tanks and then the tanks that were landed right after that. So they'd be the first infantry ashore, and they'd be then followed by the Gap assault teams that would be busting lanes through the various beach gaps. And that's quite a place to put yourself on a landing.
Yeah,
but of
without a doubt.
course, yeah, so we'll come back to the truth of that in a bit. The other thing was that he planned to, since he was with the 16th, the idea was that he was planning to go inland with them and continue covering them. And we'll get back to that as well. And then the biggest misconception is that his folks showed the bloody carnage of the first wave. And we'll get back to that as well. And finally, the last one is that the lab accident, the thing that wiped out all the film except for the Magnificent 11. And that's what they tend to call his surviving film, which is kind of funny. Capa thought only 8 of his photos survived. Charles Wertenbaker, who ended up his good friend and wrote the initial book, he said that there were only 7. Magnum's, the ICP, International Center for Photography, their digitally recreated contact sheet only shows 9 photos, 9 negatives. There's one more that they don't have the negative for, but we know it's his. It's the face in the surf, which we'll take a look at here earlier. And there's never been any evidence for more than 10 of them, but somehow it's gotten the name of the Magnificent 11 photos. And
before we dive deep into his actual D-Day actions, I think there's probably some value in talking about his experience in was it Sicily, where he's supposed to go in and with the jumping echelon at some point. I think it's some
Yeah.
value in talking about his experiences there and how it'll, again, his past performance is a good indicator of his future performance in terms of what happens there than what happens on D-Day.
Yeah, that's a good point. He had covered the North African operation to a degree. He took some pictures at El Guitar, and he took some pictures with an air unit. But then he headed back to England, to London. He had a girlfriend there, and he needed to work some things out there with him. Then he found out he was about to get fired, so he ran back down to North Africa to try to get in on Operation Husky. Well, his detour up to England had basically taken him out of the planning for Operation Husky. Husky was, of course, the invasion of Sicily.
Just-
So all the slots had been taken at that point, and he found out that he could get that one of the photographers who's supposed to accompany the airborne drop had been sick, gotten sick. So he was going to go up and take that guy's place. The reality was that he went up on the second drop. For those of you who remember the Sicily operation, the first drop occurred the night of the invasion, just leading to the invasion. And then 2 days later, a second regimental size drop was put in there to reinforce the beachhead. The way Capa told it was that he flew along as an observer on the first night's drop. And then, by God, he just had to get in the action. So on the second night's drop, he flew along and jumped in. And then he has a story about being behind enemy lines for 4 days with two other guys, and they were sneaking around, blowing up bridges and things like this. But even Whalen, his biographer, had to say no, he didn't ride along that first night. On the second night, he didn't jump. He did ride. He took some pictures, but he came on back, got the film off immediately, and it was a good film, taken just from inside the aircraft. In reality, he came ashore in Sicily about a week later, I think it's 9 days later, riding in on a LST with the ground support elements of the 9th Air Transport Command. So, and that was actually published. It was published in magazines, but everybody just kind of forgets that and then goes with the
Well, he had
misleading.
he had essentially shirked going to jump school in England, didn't he? And
Yeah,
they weren't going to let him jump without jump training, and was scheduled to go, and he basically made an excuse of why he wasn't there, or he just basically ignored it and said, and mentally said, I'm not going, and that's it.
yeah. We'll skip ahead. We'll go past the Salerno and the Italy operation, and we'll go into his arrival in England. And he gets there about late February. He'd just come from the Anzio beachhead. He'd spent about 10 days there. And he was initially slotted to be embedded with the United States Army Air Force. It was probably that same troop carrier command that he was with in Sicily and Italy, because they just moved up to UK as well. Well, shortly after that, they start looking for people to jump in with the 82nd and 101st on D-Day. And there weren't a whole lot of people volunteering for that.
I don't understand why.
I don't understand why. So the Life Office there volunteered two people, Bob Landry, who's another great photographer, and Bob Capa. And they and their good friend Larry Lesueur, who is from a different agency, they kept not showing up at the dates for the jump training. And finally, the young lieutenant who was in charge of pulling these guys together caught them at one of Capa's parties. And he waited until they were all really drunk and feeling brave and got them to sign the waivers and said, okay, we'll meet tomorrow at 9 a.m. We'll take you all on out there. And none of the three of them showed up. Two of them said that they stepped off a curb, twisted their ankle. They couldn't possibly go to school. And Capa, he just couldn't find Capa.
Made himself scarce.
So that's why the 101st and 82nd, the only photos we have of them are from U.S. Army photographers from the 165th Photo Signal Company. So having kind of worked his way out of that assignment. They turned around, they assigned him to cover they signed him to the ground still photo pool. And still photo pool is a mechanism where they could share photos. You couldn't get all the photographers or newsmen in that the various agencies wanted. So they just selected a few, and then their products would be available to anybody who wanted to pay a nominal user fee for that for the pictures. So they had 4 of them for the American side of the beaches, and Capa was one of them. A guy named Bert Brandt was going to come in on the right side of the invasion at Omaha with the 116th Regimental Combat Team.
Mm-hmm.
And then 2 more, Landry and a guy named Carroll, were going to come in over at Utah Beach. Now, because of their still photo pool, the point of the still photo pool was also to get images back as soon as possible to the papers in the States. So they weren't supposed to go inland. They're supposed to get their stuff back as quickly as they could. So Capa was never really supposed to set foot on the beach. And that kind of bleeds into the thing about, well, when was he, or where was he supposed to land and with whom? And in his book, he said that the night before the invasion, while he was still in the troop ship crossing the channel, he was facing a decision. He had to decide whether he wanted to go in with Company E, which was the very first wave. And he had a great story with them earlier during the Sicily operation, apparently. Or go in with Company B, which looked like a more interesting assignment. They had to seize the high ground at a certain point. And about that time, he says the colonel commanding the regimental combat team, Colonel Taylor, came along and offered him a third option, which is to come in with the regimental headquarters. But Capa, he just decided that he was a gambler and he was going to go in with the very first wave. And that's kind of gone down into pseudo history as what happened. He landed with the very first infantry troops of the invasion. It's not at all what happened. The unit he said he landed with was on a completely different troop ship. And they loaded in their landing craft an hour and a half before when Capa said he landed in his or loaded in his. So the time, distance factors, it just doesn't make any sense.
Plus, except for the one boat team, the unit he was supposed to land with, he doesn't land anywhere near where he lands.
Exactly right. Yeah.
And that boat team is one of the most famous boat teams to land on Omaha on D-Day as well.
Yeah, that's the one that Lieutenant Spaulding was in charge of, one of the boat teams from Company E. And they probably made the first penetration of the bluffs right between the E1 and E3.
E3, yep. Yeah, I typically take my tours there when I do my Overlord portion of my tours. We go right down there. We come in around WN 62 and then come down to the beach and walk down and head right over to that spot. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a beautiful area.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
But I mean, it gives you a very immediate and intimate understanding of the terrain when you stand there and you understand what they had to deal with, especially with the bluffs. So
I was back there for the 80th anniversary, and I really wanted to go down the trail that Spaulding's platoon had gone up, but they had some platform they were building there, and they closed the trail, and it was very disappointing not being able to do it.
Yeah.
So, in fact, it turns out that Capa had been scheduled all along to be in the landing craft that carried in the regimental commander of the 16th. We've got the manifest or at least we have the landing tables that show his position in it. And there's going to be a reporter there as well. And that reporter was Jack Thompson, Beaver Thompson, yeah.
Beaver Thompson, yeah.
Beaver's a very well-known war correspondent. He jumped in with the 82nd, I believe, in both North Africa and in Sicily. And he was kind of, I won't say he was the Ernie Pyle kind of guy, because Ernie Pyle was much different report. But both of them were very much concerned with the frontline battle, what's really going on up front. And Beaver Thompson's extremely well thought of. But remember, Capa wasn't really supposed to land. You know, he was just going to ride in, take photos, and leave. And then that brings up the second point. Okay, not only did he not land with Company E, but he didn't land at H hour either. The regimental commander's landing craft, was 2 craft in that wave, an LCVP and an LCM. And they're supposed to come in at 8:05, which was 95 minutes after H hour. But as they got up to the beach, Colonel Taylor said, well, I can't land where I want to land. The fighting's so severe there, I'm not going to be able to get up, get around, and exercise any command over anything. So he cruised down the beach a little bit till he found the gap where Spaulding's platoon had landed. Now, Spaulding's platoon had landed at the same place that a Gap Assault Team number 10 had come in. And because, as you pointed out, they're between WN62 and WN64, and both of the draws those things were guarding were under direct assault, the area in between them was not very well covered by fire. They're much more concerned with attacking or putting fire on the units that were attacking the up the draws, or trying to attack up the draws. So Spaulding's unit got up to the base of the cliffs, only lost 3 guys. Gap Assault Team 10 landed about 6:30 and spent 20 minutes without taking any fire. It wasn't until they blew their first gap that the Germans said, hey, something's over here we really need to pay attention to. And that's when they started getting some fire over into that area.
Yeah, I think that there's some value in talking about why how that a phenomenon occurred. And this is something I always talk about on my tours when we're there, is that the Germans massed their defenses at the draws because they know that's the only logical way off the beaches. So they have to defend them. So they put these resistance nests, the Widerstandsnesters, that are there to protect the exit draws. But they're not going to waste, especially because they don't have sufficient manpower or weapon systems to defend the full length of the beach. So there are these somewhat dead zones where there's not a lot of German fire. And this is where Spaulding's boat crew and Colonel Taylor's echelon come in. But I think I also need to point out that you meticulously point that out in your book, because you bring out the landing tables. You talk about the landing echelons and the timing of those landing echelons, and what ships and boats were in those echelons and where they were supposed to go. You explain how the tides influence the landings as well. It's very well documented. Again, I'm going to keep foot stomping. This is definitely worth the purchase, folks, because it is very methodically and meticulously laid out why those elements landed where they did, and then how it affects the overall Capa legend. And that's what we're starting to really get into the meat and potatoes of right now.
Yeah. We might as well jump ahead to the next photo.
Okay, let's do it. Here comes the big ones.
So Capa came riding in with Colonel Taylor's LCVP, and they arrive about 15 minutes late. Depending on the source, they either arrive at 8:15 or 8:20. I kind of went with 8:20, so that seemed to be the predominant number. So that's an hour and 50 minutes after H hour. So he clearly didn't come in with the first wave, obviously. As you look at that picture there, it's an interesting picture. It's one of 5 that he took from the ramp of his LCVP. And it's probably the clearest. Some of his most famous photos from this set of 5 are much more blurred, jerky. The troops are a little bit closer in. And it gives the false impression that, well, of course, the photo looks bad because he's in combat. This is a tough situation. And the impression really gives one that, yeah, he's in the first wave and he's getting shot at. And that's reinforced by the caption that Life put on it. Capa did not provide any caption notes. Caption notes are a page that has a note describing the action for each one of the frames. And then that helps the guys in the editorial room in the back go back and actually apply a real caption on it for publication. He provided no caption notes for his D-Day photos, so it ended up with a guy in New York who was kind of semi-aware of what happened on D-Day, and so he started crafting it along these lines. As you know, he's in the first wave, they're pinned down, blah, 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 blah. Very, very dramatic. In fact, in Capa's wave, there were about 120 people, as I recall. No one was hit. They all made it to the shingle embankment there in the back without a single loss. And that's coming from the captain who was the company commander for the headquarters company. And he was in the landing craft that was right next to Capa's. In fact, that 120 guys only had one person wounded for the entire day, and that was a doctor, part of their medical section, a dentist who was wounded. So, yeah, but the average person not knowing any better would see a photo, especially those who've never been in combat or in war, or even in the military, and they're going to believe the caption on it. But the caption was really just life selling their photo and their photographer. Hey, look, we've got a really sexy war dramatic photo here. So the initial misleading or deception on these photos really occurred back in Life's home office, not Capa. He kind of embraced it and embellished it a little bit later when he wrote his book in 1947. But getting back to this picture, you see a trail of troops right ahead of you. Those are the ones that came off of his landing craft. You see on the left is tank dozer number 10, which had supported Gap Assault Team 10. Directly ahead, you see the back of a wading tank, or a tank with deep wading kit. And to the right of it are two of the DD tanks. And to the right of that, off right at the corner of the frame, you see another tank with a deep wading kit. And if you could see it all, there'd be a ammunition trailer, armored ammunition trailer. It's tagging along. And you're going to see in many photos on D-Day, you're going to see the same group of tanks in various positions. In the back behind the tanks, you see kind of a two-layered thing, and that's the shingle/sand embankment. And if you've been D-Day, I know you have, if you've been to Omaha Beach since then, you don't see that. It was all bulldozed off by the engineers during the development of the beach. But it used to be about an embankment about 7 feet high. Of it was shingle stones, little round stones. And on top of that was about another 6 or 7 feet of sand dune. And then you can see a number of troops lined up on both the sand level and the shingle level. So it should be obvious to anybody that Capa was not in the first wave.
Yeah, the presence of those troops all the way forward past the shingle line tells you right then and there that he's not in the assault wave, that first assault wave, because that would be the first assault wave all the way up there.
Yeah.
And if you've paid any attention to or if you've done any reading about how the landing tables worked and the sequencing of the landings, you'll know that the echelons are supposed to come in fairly rapidly behind each other. It was a very tight timeline for disgorging troops on the beach. And you'll see, like, if you do readings about E1 and E3 draws, those timelines were completely out of whack because of the amount of resistance there. Whereas this one, they do a pretty good job of sticking to the timeline. I mean, the tide messes with them quite a bit, and the obstacle belts as well. But as you stated, Gap teams 9 and 10, especially 10, do a really good job of clearing the obstacle belts.
Yeah. You don't get the feel for it from this photo. This photo, like I said, was done about an hour and 50 minutes after H-hour. But the tide is coming a long way. At H-hour, it was a good 200 to 300, depending where you're on the beach, 200, 300 yards from where they got out of their landing craft across open sand just to get up to this point of where the obstacles are. Those first troops ashore had a long open area to cross. And I don't think people really get the good feel for that. I don't believe that, as an example, the famous Saving Private Ryan conveyed that at all.
Yeah, unfortunately, like, you don't have a lot of time in a movie to display the tidal works there, and there was a key bit of decision making that had to go into when the landing would go, because they were worried about if we go at high tide, we're going to have problems getting the boats back up off the beach, and if we go at low tide, yes, uh they'll have more ground to cover getting up to the shingle and beyond it, but we'll be able to get the boats. Be able to retract the boats off the beach and get them out of there and move the next echelons in. There was a lot of hemming and hawing over when the landings would end up happening. Um, and because they decide on landing when they do, it also influences the Allied beaches as well, because because the tides are different at, say, Gold and Sword and Juno, that they have to land an hour later for H hour, which kind of it definitely, the sequence is not clean, but the reasoning behind the landings you can understand when you think about the timing.
It's what I like to call a very cruel set of compromises. Yeah, you just couldn't get everything you want, and no matter what you chose, somebody was going to have a very bad day.
But I mean, you laid out fairly well in your book. Just by looking at the tide, looking at the troops that are on the beach, one, you know that he didn't go in on the first wave, and two, you look at the tides and where the waters are based on the tidal data that's available, which they studied to a fine degree to put the landing tables together. You can tell that it's definitely not H hour when these were shot.
In fact, by the time this was shot, Spaulding's platoon is probably up there on the crest at this point, if not already over it. And after Spaulding came in Company G of the 16th Regiment, and they had funneled up there as well. So probably at this point, you've got
Captain
Company
Dawson's
Plus
men,
up there.
yeah.
Yeah, Captain Dawson's.
Yeah, so and the other thing that you pointed out is, look at the stature of the men that are advancing. They're standing upright and moving. If you're under fire, you're in a crouch, you're moving fast, you're attempting to move fast, you're moving from cover to cover. These men, especially the ones that are moving past the tank, are moving out of cover, and they're doing so in the standing position. Now, the only exceptions to this are to the left side of the photo. For the folks that can't see this, there's a number of men in the prone position around some of the hedgehog obstacles. And
good
I know
segue to the next slide.
exactly. I know you want to talk about this, because this to me is pretty amazing. It hit me like a lightning bolt when I started looking at these after I pulled out. I have printed out versions of these photographs so I can look at them in detail. And so when I'd pull them out to go along while I was reading your book, it hit me like a lightning bolt. These guys aren't hiding.
Let me put a little context in here. Once Capa took his 5 photos on the landing craft, and he somehow accidentally ended up out of the landing craft and in the surf. He only had 5
courtesy
photos
of the
left
bosun mate's boot.
Exactly. He only had 5 photos left in his camera, and he took 2 photos of 2 scenes and 1 photo of a separate scene. Some of them were mixed up, though, so I'm skipping his first photo and going to a set of 2 photos that he took as his second and third. And that's a group of soldiers. And if you look at just about anything, any source, it talks about these guys pinned down in the surf. Even the Army's Omaha beachhead describes it as such. But now go to the next slide, if you would, please. I would like to take credit for all of this, but I can't. I first saw a diagram showing something like this back in the early 2000s on some website. I don't even remember which one it was. Peter Jute, who runs his own website, and he's also a D-Day tour guide. But he posted most of this stuff, so I'm really just kind of repeating what the others had come up there. I really wish I could take credit for it, but as you take a look at this, what you end up seeing is really probably Gap Assault Team 10 still trying to clear the last obstacles in one of their lanes. And looking at individual details, I've got a couple of helmets there that outline in kind of a half circle thing. And they do show within that icon a half circle painted arc on their helmets. And Schaeff had put out a standard ETO helmet marking system. So you can determine by the markings on a helmet what somebody was. There's one for NCOs and one for officers. There's one for military police. And for the engineers, there was this arc. And you see two of the guys have arcs. There are four guys around this one headshot. You got two guys with engineer helmets. You got two other guys peering at the same task. So that kind of looks like we've got engineers working. And then there are three rectangular boxes there, and they highlight some line that is stretched across the photo. And that line turns out is a form of primer cord, yeah, a form of detonation cord that they used at the time. And so when they cleared a gap, what they did was they had guys go and put charges on each one of the obstacles, and then another guy ran a reel, the old RL39 that you have with comma wires, but it would have det cord in it. He'd run it from obstacle to obstacle and form a main ring charge. And then somebody would pull the charge or the igniter, and it would detonate. So you've got this det cord running from obstacle to obstacle. And a couple of the other photos, you'll actually see some of the Higginson packs lying in the crotches of a couple of the obstacles. So these guys are still trying to clear out the last of the obstacles in this portion of the gap. In the back, I've got circled two guys, and maybe this is my whimsy, but the head of the GAT was Lieutenant Gregory, Army Lieutenant, and the head of the Navy Combat Demolitions Unit that was part of that was a Lieutenant Karnowski. And it got to a point where the water was getting deep, and most of the GAT couldn't work out there, but the two officers then swam out and started placing individual charges on the remaining individual obstacles that hadn't been blown with the first blown. And I kind of would like to think that that's probably those two guys right there. That's the same location that the Karnowski's map of the incident of his team's activity shows.
Yeah, that's right. You supplied a copy of the hand-drawn map in your book, so we can you can actually see that where they were positioned. It's facially, you can't. It's not a precise document, but it's a hand-drawn map. But it definitely does show them back away from the obstacle belt where the others were working.
So, this to me is a picture of courage in action. These guys have been out here now for 2 hours under fire, still working exposed around these obstacles, trying to blow things. And I'm just, that's one of the, to me, unrecognized gems of Capa's photos.
Yeah, you just happened to turn around at the right time and snap two pictures of this team just going about their business.
Yeah.
And it's an amazing photograph. Like I said, once you really look at it in detail, and it kind of hits you like a lightning bolt at what is going on here. Because frankly, I didn't look at it close enough to see the primer cord until I knew what I was looking for at that point. And I've done some work with demolitions too. I should have known better.
Okay,
the mystery photo next.
Yeah,
this one is.
This is the famous face.
Yeah, this one always is. That was me, or that was my grandfather, or that was my father. You always hear lots of folks claiming that that's them.
Yeah. And I don't mean to shoot down any family stories or images either of the dearly departed grandfather or whatever, but almost all the guys were from over on Fox Green Beach, because that's where supposedly Capa was. And so none of the associations really pan out. But we're not quite sure why Capa decided to get this picture. Once again, the framing is odd if he's looking for just a soldier in the surf. And this is probably the most blurred photo that he had taken of the 10. Now, to me, it's not very interesting, except for up in the upper right-hand corner, you see a big blur, and that is turns out to be LCI L 94 coming into beach. And the 94 is the vessel that Capa ends up fleeing the beach on. And so it's very interesting that it just happened to catch it at this moment. And we're going to come back to that a little bit, but we'll go to the next slide as well. Now, this is actually a two-picture set, but it's a little bit odd. The first picture he took when he got off into the surf was a picture just like this. And then he took the other three pictures we just looked at, the shoes of the engineers and facing the surf. And then his last picture, he comes back over to this side and takes this picture. Now, at this time, Capa is crouching behind tank dozer number 10. And so that's why his view is forward of these guys who are on that last line of obstacles. So he's got two pictures of this. And this one actually does show a bunch of troops crouching in the shelter of the obstacles. And this is exactly where the LCM that came in with Capa beached. And so this is probably some of the troops from that bunch that are hunkered down there. However, it doesn't look like they're actively under fire. And the main reason it doesn't is because there are two guys in the center frame who are standing up there walking upright.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're easy to see there.
Yeah, and the second photo Capa has of this shows the same thing, except for the guys shows people walking further down to the right. So it just looks to me like, okay, they got out, they're taking shelter, they're getting their bearings before they move forward. There's a guy with an MP's helmet band painting. So that's probably that from that LCM that had some MPs in the LCM.
And they would have come in with the headquarters elements.
Yep. Yep. And the other thing is that two of the hedgehog obstacles have looks like white streaks. And those are the Higginson packs that were used for demolition. It was basically just a canvas rectangular bag, and it was stuffed with C2, which was the plastic explosive of that day. And they were easy then to slap onto an obstacle prime and then detonate. So that indicates that the demolitions effort for this particular band had been prepared further from what we just saw with the other two guys, the other two photos of the engineers. But of course, they can't blow it because there are troops in and amongst all the obstacles. So, and that's why GAT 10 ended up kind of having to stop, break, and go back up into the sand dunes themselves, because if they started blowing any more obstacles, they'd be killing too many troops. So the other thing to notice on this is that for all this talk about his boys, the 16th Infantry, and he loved them, and from the time he got in the water, all of his photos were taken angled offshore. Not a one of them is towards the fighting ahead of him. And you can
except for the initial ones, yeah.
Just the ones in the ramp. That's right.
They're all looking back towards either parallel to the shore or back into the ocean.
Yeah, and he just had 5 from this phase. The other thing I'd like to point out is that if you go back and take a look at all the photos, you see that there's been virtually no rise in the tide during the period these photos have been taken. Now, the tide was rising, depending on who you believe, 1 foot every 10 minutes or 11 minutes. So the tide is, yeah, it's hard to say, but there may be some variation from waves coming in or whatnot, but it has moved very, very little in the time that he's been taking photos. So basically his photo taking had ended within less than 5 minutes.
Yeah, I was going to say they were all taken in a rapid manner, probably, like you said, a space of a few minutes, because like there is not really any variation in the tide level across the breadth and width of his photos.
Now, he claimed that he made it all the way up to the embankment and had some interactions with some folks and exposed a second roll of film and then ruined some more film. But only thing that's ever surfaced has been the part of this one film taken from behind the tank. Nothing from the other camera, and none of the people who he claimed he met further up the beach remember being there, or mentioned him in their memoirs. And he appeared to just about immediately gotten back on at LCI in 94 when it landed. If you can go ahead and hit the next slide.
Yeah, I think one of the things I want to point out is that he and I'm not, and listen, we're not throwing any shade on him. I mean, he landed with the troops, he took his photographs, and he's not a combatant, so nobody's
And he wasn't
expecting him
supposed to
to
land.
be nobody's expecting him to be a hero and run around and blow things up and shoot Germans and things of that nature. And he didn't have to be there. Actually kind of had to, is where his position was, but unlike a fighting man, he doesn't have a mission outside of taking his photographs. But there are inconsistencies in the story that are not backed up. The only thing that's backed up is the only thing we can say accurately is what you've laid out in terms of we're using the evidence we have at hand to give a window of when he was actually on the beach and what he was doing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, this next set of photos, the one on the left, of course, is the face in the surf, and you see LCI 94 nosing into the beach. The right-hand photo is a frame grab from a movie film that was shot by chief photographer's mate, David Ruley. Ruley was a Coast Guard cameraman, motion picture cameraman, and he was assigned to the LCI 94. And so we just happened to have Ruley filming Capa at the same time Capa is filming the 94. Now, actually, the photo on the right, or the film on the right, was taken a couple minutes later, because at this point, the 94 has beached. But you can see by the outlines and the obstacles, it's the very same obstacles. To me, though, the really important part of this is the film clip from the right. It's a very short one, but it shows some interesting things. And the first thing is it shows, if we continue on, you see 3 different groups of troops moving upright up the beach. 2 of them are from landing craft on the left side. And then just past the tank dozer, which is in the center, you see the shadow of another, looks like a tank with a great big chimney. And that chimney was the exhaust duct for DD tanks. Okay, so the first thing that tells you is now we've identified 3 duplex drive tanks right there. And well, as we know from the debacle that happened with the 741st Tank Battalion, that you had 2 that managed to swim in, and then you had 3 landing directly on the beach. And so it looks like we've found where all 3 of those were. So you've got 2 standard tanks, a tank dozer, and 3 DD tanks. And that's probably the best supported section of the beach right there, as far as the 6 big guns able to support them. And in fact, one of the DD tanks, I forget which one it was, actually knocked out the 66 millimeter gun that was down there at that flank of the beach fairly early on, a major contribution to success.
Yeah, that's
So,
when you take out the main guns in those ambushers that are firing down the beach, you're reducing a lot of the direct fire on the landing forces, and it doesn't do anything to stop the incoming fire, the indirect fire weapons that are beyond the beach, but it certainly helps to reduce the fire and then open up that ground and make it more accessible, since you don't have that sweeping fire coming down the beach at you.
yeah, and in fact, this is the area where the next 3 reinforcement regiments landed that day. And I think 8 of their 9 battalions basically followed the Spalding path up the hill. I think 1 battalion went up through the Ruquet Draw.
Yeah,
But yeah, so those are his 10, as far as we know, photos that he took on D-Day. If you don't mind going down to slide 20. Now, everywhere Capa went, he kept running into other photographers. And it turned out, this is another shot from LCI 94. As they're unloading troops, the stern started getting swept away by the tide towards a mined obstacle. So they pulled back and they then landed again. And this is virtually the same position that Capa landed from his boat, if you line up the various landmarks. Just coincidentally, they just moved 50 to 100 yards. But this photo was taken by the CO, the captain of the 94, Gene Gislason, who is an avid amateur photographer himself. And he took a series of photos from the open con during D-Day. Most of them are in bad condition like this one, and there aren't really all that many of them. But the significant thing here to me is if you look where the Red Cross symbol is, and just a little bit to the left and a little bit up, you see just the tops of a hedgehog.
In this area here.
Yeah. And
right
here. Exactly. And this was taken only about 20 to 25 minutes after Capa's photos were. And that gives you an idea of how fast the tide was coming in at the time. Yeah. So they were also, really fighting time element.
I would say also looking at the tanks that have advanced up to the shingle, notice where the water line is now. They've clearly have exited the water, but the water is following them up the beach.
Yeah. High water stand, I think, was in about 2 more hours. So they were getting to the point where either you climbed up the embankment or you're going to stay wet for the day. And of course, that drowned out so many vehicles that had been stranded on the sand there.
And if memory serves, you used in order to ensure that you were looking at the same craft, you matched up the positioning of these ration boxes here that are on the deck to confirm that it is what the 94 that came in, and that was the one that he came out on.
Yeah, I kind of went overboard on that just because so many people were trying to sharpshoot it that it couldn't be the right one and couldn't be the same one.
Yeah, but it's that level of detail and photo interpretation that helps to nail down your hypothesis.
The logo was kind enough to describe it as a detective procedural.
Yeah.
And that's probably not a bad description because, most histories just say, and then Alpha Company went up on the right and nobody doubts it. But when you're trying to fight a legend that's been in place for 80 years, you really have to kind of get in the weeds and prove you know what you're talking about.
And again, you're very methodical and meticulous in putting all the supporting evidence to your assertions. And I think folks that pick up your book are going to get a lot out of it. Not just the debunking portion of it. If they are unfamiliar with how the landings were supposed to go, especially for that specific sector, they're going to get a lot out of it and a deep understanding about how an amphibious assault takes place on an enemy held beach. So don't shortchange yourself there either.
Well, thank you very much. Coming from you, that's high praise indeed.
But I believe the skipper shot more than one photo. There was several of them, weren't they? This is an excellent one though.
Yeah, and they're kind of backed up by the motion picture film that Rulli took of it as well. They both show a picture of a swamped landing craft as they're pulling away.
Yeah. Do we want to slide on to the next?
Yeah, let's go to the next one. One of the problems Capa had during the entire D-Day thing was that he was either being followed by military photographers or he was following military photographers. I mean, if you take a look at side-by-side comparison of the pictures they took, it's like they were both joined at the hip. When he got on the chase, there was a Robert Sargent, who is a Coast Guard photographer, was assigned to the ship, as well as a guy named Whitworth, who is a motion picture photographer for the Coast Guard. He was on that ship. And all during the embarkation period and the pre-sailing period and the overnight period during the transit, they all took pictures and they're all almost identical. It's almost hilarious.
And he landed in an area that had a significant landmark that ends up appearing in other photographs that help staple down that he's actually where we think he is, where you proved that he was, the Roman ruins. And the reason we know that is because we matched up the Roman ruins pictures that had also the tanks in them, and then the tanks that appear in those photographs also appear in Capa's photographs. So it's like you said, there's all these things that work together to prove where he was and when he was there. And I don't know if he knew that was all going to happen. If he did, I think he might have tightened up his story a little bit over time. But I mean, hindsight is 2020 in this regard. But if you had to pick a place to land, this one had landmarks. It had specificity to it that allowed you to look through all the nonsense and look through all of the mythology and the legend that had been built around it to drill down and actually prove where he was and then when he was there.
Yeah. Now that's a good segue about the Roman ruins. This was a picture after the LCI 94 had pulled away. It got hit twice by what looks like about a 75 millimeter gun, judging by the holes. But I kind of thought that both those guns had been knocked out by that time of the day.
Yeah, I
but
thought the
maybe they were
76
recruited.
over at WN62 had been knocked out by then. I could be wrong.
Yeah. But anyhow, so it had two holes in it. They're backing way out, and Capa took called it his one last shot of the beach. Actually, I think there were four of these. But you see outlined in little white boxes there are the two buildings in the Roman ruins. And you see the assembly of tanks there that we'd seen earlier. Tank Dozer 10 is on the left there, and the others are in the center.
Yeah, and for the folks that are listening, the Roman ruins aren't exactly Roman ruins. This whole area of the coastline had been a vacation spot, and a number of villas had been built along the coastline. And the Germans either turned them into fortifications or destroyed them so that they would leave no place for cover if there happened to be a landing there. But in this case, the foundations were still there and some of the walls were still there. There's some close-up pictures of them. I believe you have some of them in the slide deck, but I mean, you can Google it and find it very easily if you want to take a look at what they look like.
And they're also important because we know that Spalding and then Company G climbed the bluff right there, just to the left side of the Roman ruins. There's a wall there that they took shelter along as they climbed up. So that kind of pulls everything together. We know where everything happened. And that one slide kind of does it for us.
Yeah, it's a beautiful slide, beautiful picture. It joins the two together, shows you the full expanse of the beach, the clustering of the troops and the tanks on it. And it's just a great shot. Not only that, you have the smoke buildup from the firing in the area, and also from deadfall on the ground, burning from shell impacts. It's a pretty amazing piece of photography.
There's one of the companion photos to this taken within just a few seconds or minutes of it. You can hardly see the Roman ruins because the wafting smoke has now covered them, and that kind of helped with not getting fire on that part of the beach. As the smoke wafted in and out, it also obscured vision of the Germans covering that part of the area.
Yeah. So we've been going for almost 90 minutes now, but I want to kind of hit the accelerator a little bit because really we definitely need to talk about Capa's exfiltration from the beach and then the subsequent what your assessment is on how many photos he shot, and what you think happened to him if all of that is relevant in putting a bow on all this, and I wanted to make sure we got to it since we've been going for quite a while. I don't want to keep you all day, and I don't want to keep our listeners all day. I'm sure they're going to want to do other things, but this is, to me, it's very important. It's the postscript and how it impacts his mythology going on after all of this.
Okay, sure. Let's like you say, hit the accelerator. On the way back, he changed cameras. He took, based on the surviving negatives, it looks like he took 60 photos while he was on LCI 94. And again, he and Rulli took photos of the exact same stuff. If you go to 28 briefly, here's a from Rulli's film showing Capa in an LCVP they're offloading some wounded, and Capa's going to head back to his ship. And we had photos of Capa that were taken by Capa from within that LCVP. From here, he goes on to the Chase and USS Chase, which was an attack transport. So same one that carried him over. And they were delayed at the beach for a while because they had to send their landing craft back to help guys get ashore. But they ended up leaving the transport area about, as I recall, about 6:30 that night and heading back to England. And Capa's transport landed, or correction, anchored in Weymouth Harbor about 5:30 in the morning. He was in the same convoy as the ship, the Carroll, USS Carroll, and that carried Burt Brent. Burt Brent was the other photographer that day. And they didn't really expect to have much in the way of casualties and people coming off of those transports. The casualties are supposed to go back on LCTs that had medical contingents aboard. So it took a lot longer to unload the transports when they got in. And as a result, Burt Brent gets ashore and he gets his photos in about 3 hours earlier than Capa's, 2 hours earlier than Capa's. So Capa has now lost the race for the scoop. And but for some reason, he gets off of his transport about 12:45 that day. And it takes about 8 to 9 hours for his film to make it to the Life labs. And okay, we know that the lab accident story is false. It couldn't happen. It just couldn't. And what I believe happened, and I think it's logical, but I need to say that I believe this and I'm not stating it as a fact. The film coming from the beach had to go through sensors first. So it's taken directly to the SHAEF headquarters and sensors would look at it. And if it didn't look like it was all that sensitive, they would leave the presumed secret label on it, but send it back to the individual lab for them to process. And once they process it, they bring it back in the sensor to actually see what was there and either mark it or pass it. The stuff that they thought was more sensitive, they labeled top secret and they sent it back to the lab with a custody officer who then would have it developed with virtually nobody else present to take a look at it. And the guy who's in charge of the photo group for Life there was a guy named John Morris, pardon me. And his stories of what happened that night are so confusing, contradictory, and whatnot that none of it makes sense. And Alan Coleman had spent a lot of time communicating with Morris, and by the end of it, Morris basically said, okay, I must have been wrong about all of this, the entire story about the lab accident. So what really happened was, in the umbrella of fortitude, the fortitude deceptions, we were trying to pose the Normandy landings as a diversionary landing, a smaller landing that would hopefully pull the Germans' attention away from Pas de Calais. And the idea was that the Germans would continue keeping maximum strength with Pas de Calais, and that would slow down reinforcement to the Normandy landings. And so if you take a look at the film that was released shortly after the invasion, you see it's a very limited amount of combat power is actually visible, just as in the daily SHAEF briefings. Very little actual talk about what was going on the ground. And to me, I just think that the most likely thing that happened to Capa's film was the censor said, it shows too many ships, it shows too much combat power. We're trying to get the Germans to think that this is a limited operation. And so I believe it was probably sacrificed to the censor's red pen.
Now, do we think the originals, negatives and any resulting photographs were destroyed and that's it? They're gone? Or are they like the Ark of the Covenant? They're hidden away in some government warehouse somewhere.
Well, I don't know. My suspicion is that life didn't care about it. By the time that the block on those photos would have been lifted, Paris was being liberated. We're tearing across France. We're at the door of Germany. And it wasn't news. I mean, Life was a news organization. It was outside of the news cycle. And I suspect that it just got filed away. It was never reclaimed. And the military, you've got mandatory re-examine your files and dispose of these and just discard those. And I think it just got thrown out in the housekeeping. We've done some attempts to check. I've gone through as much of NARA's selection as they'll allow me, and there's just absolutely no sign of it at all. Even
That's
in
a shame.
Capa's personal collection of photos, there's no sign of it. Now, normally when you had a roll of film, you printed a contact sheet, which is one page with a bunch of small pictures of it. And all the contact sheets for that are missing, which is exactly what would have happened with a censor if they deemed it top secret. They just would have kept all the prints, the contact sheets and whatnot.
Yeah.
And so if you take a look at what Capa film does show, it's just a very limited amount. It's, the soldier's view on the beach. And it's not very wide, it's not very big. It's just typical chaos, but that doesn't tell you anything about the bigger battle. And I've got a compare and contrast, which I don't have on here, but Capa took two photos coming off the beach, looking to the east and to the west. And neither of those show very much at all. Just a couple ships. I mean, there were 1,500 ships, crafts, boats, whatever, off of Omaha that day. And those two photos probably show total maybe 7. Now, there's a lot more photos within that range that are missing. So these other photos may have shown more.
Yeah, you pointed out that the numbers on the mock contact sheet place these photos at like what 29, 30, 31, 32. So where's the rest of the photographs from that roll? And he said he exposed how many? 2 rolls at least on the beach.
That's what he said. Yeah, the only evidence is the 10 from the one roll.
Yeah, so it's a shame if that's what happened to them. If they just are lost to the dustbin of history because somebody was just cleaning out files and decided to burn them or throw them away, or whatever. That's a shame.
I want to put it in context. I've kind of come down hard on Capa on a lot of things, and his habit of exaggerating and et cetera, et cetera. But initially, the Capa legend wasn't started by him. It was a guy doing I think his name was Dennis Flanagan, who did the captions in New York, who first said it was the first wave. And it was apparently the head of Life's photo department who initially said, yeah, the rest of your film was ruined by originally seawater. So the initial exaggerations or whatever kind of were planted by other people. It wasn't until 1947 that Capa then kind of embraced those, embroidered them, and then the full legend came to be. But in this case, he wasn't the originator of most of the nonsense.
Yeah, well, I think that if folks pick up your book, they're going to get a lot out of it in terms of understanding Capa, understanding that the legend that was built around him, his back history, and then his photography on D-Day, and then everything that happened with it. I can't again more highly recommend Back into Focus.
Thank you.
Chuck, thanks so much for coming on. It's been a real eye opener and very educational, and I hope everybody who's listening and watching gets that as well. It's just been a pleasure, and again, thanks for your diligence in this, because there's a lot of folks that would write a book about this and not go through the lengths that you did to prove your point, and do it factually, instead of just saying, I say this because this is what I believe. So much of the things that you've put forth in this presentation are backed up by fact. And thanks again for coming on. I appreciate it.
No, thank you. I very much appreciate the opportunity, and God bless you and the work you've been doing.
Thanks. And again, folks, I'll have the links and where you can pick up Chuck's book. What kind of projects you have coming up soon? Are you taking a break now after you got this one in the presses, or you got stuff coming up soon?
Well, I've started a blog on Omaha Beach again, and this is from the point of view of I used to be an inspector general, and the inspector general, at least in the Army side, is don't just look at the mistake, take a look at the policies, procedures, all the institutional systemic things that might have led to this. And so I'm going back and looking at the decisions that created the disaster with the DD tanks.
Great. So
why,
what I'll do is I'll get your link, and I'll also post that up with the description of the pod. So if folks want to check out your blog and do some more in-depth reading about Omaha and the decision-making cycle there and the actions that happen there, they'll be able to do so.
That's very kind of you. Thank you.
Yep. And that's about it. We're going to wrap it up here from the We're Not Lost Private podcast. Thanks for following along, everybody. Hope you enjoyed it.